A harsh reality is that if you want to recover from binge eating and from overeating or compulsively eating, food noise does need to go down. Now, food noise has become increasingly popular as a term that a lot of people look into and understand now, especially with the advent of Ozempic and GLP-1 medications becoming much more readily available, and a lot more people utilizing these medications that have been known to support with the reduction of food noise. But is there a way to reduce food noise without the use of medication? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Clara. I'm a chartered psychologist, a healthcare professions counsel, sport and exercise psychologist, and a fitness coach. And I've spent over half a decade helping people just like you work on their relationship with food, to reduce their binge eating, to reduce their compulsive eating, in an effort to live a life that is much freer, that's not plagued by constant intrusive thoughts about food, that might then over time lend itself to at least weight maintenance or intentional weight loss over time. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the psychology of food noise and what to do if you experience consistent intrusive thoughts about food that you find yourself struggling to avoid or struggling to get rid of. And what I want to start by saying is that if you've ever tried to eliminate a thought, it's incredibly difficult to do, if not actually categorically impossible. For example, if you've ever tried to not think about a pink elephant, the likelihood is that the harder you try to not think about a pink elephant, the more vivid the image of a pink elephant is in your mind. And the same goes when it comes to food noise. In spite of it being incredibly distressing, and in spite of it being something that a lot of us who have experienced food noise try to get rid of and really want to be able to stop, any effort to try to block it out is often going to end up in experiencing those thoughts even louder. And that's because sometimes thought avoidance acts a little bit like trying to fight quicksands. It's almost like the harder you try to fight them, the more you sink in the quicksands. And it's the same with this. And obviously food noise is incredibly distressing to experience. I know it's something that I used to struggle with a lot, especially when I used to binge eat and when I struggled a lot more with my body preoccupation. I used to find myself constantly thinking about food or constantly having to make decisions about food, particularly during the weekdays. I would be very restrictive and very regulated with what I was having. I'd constantly be thinking about when's my next meal, because I used to carb cycle, I used to intermittently fast, and I used to macro track and calorie count, and I used to prep my meals and all this stuff. And so every single day I was constantly thinking about, like, what am I next going to eat? When am I next going to eat? I was constantly aware of the time of the day, constantly aware of how many calories I did in that day, which often meant that it would come to the end of the week and I would be so obsessed with the food that I hadn't been able to have that week. I would be watching food porn videos on Instagram. I'd be looking at that type of content. I'd be looking up, how to make healthy, low calorie, high protein cookies and stuff like that, and I would just be drooling, so much so that it would become very overwhelming for me. And I'd always consistently end up waking up very early on a Saturday morning, starving to death, stomach grumbling. I'd make a beeline for the shops and spend £20 or more on buying what I would consider to be complete and utter junk, and I would binge on that food throughout the day or throughout the weekend until it got to Sunday evening, and I would reset and start the cycle over again. And at the time, I remember that if anybody ever offered me something that was not within my food plan on a day where I wasn't planning on binging, I would stress out so much. So like if somebody offered me a biscuit and I took it, it was almost too much torture, because once I had one biscuit, I literally couldn't stop thinking about demolishing the rest of the packet, which of course, like in social situations, like it wouldn't have been acceptable to sit there and binge in the same way that I would have, overeaten and binged in private. And so that was incredibly distressing for me. Or I remember this one instance where I was with my best friend and her partner at the time, and they'd bought like this whole tray of, donuts for the weekend, and we'd had one and gotten into the car, and I was sat at the back with, 6 donuts left there, and I just couldn't stop thinking about the donuts, how I just wish that I was on my own so I could eat all of them. And I really felt like the thoughts were constantly intruding into my mind. I couldn't sort of peel myself away from these thoughts. And so inevitably this got me, tangled up in a pickle of restriction, because it was almost easy to not have any of the, prohibited foods that I was likely to binge on, because at least like that, I could control the food noise. It's almost like once I started, I couldn't stop. And also it was easy for me to live a life where if I just didn't buy the thing, it would be easier, because out of sight is out of mind. If I knew that I had something unhealthy in the cupboard, even something like peanut butter, I couldn't keep peanut butter in the house for years and years and years, because I knew that it was there, and if I knew that it was there, I'd have a little bit and then I'd have more, and I eat so much that I'd end up feeling sick. The same with chocolate, with lots of different things. And I know that my experience is not unique, and yet I don't experience that same level of food noise anymore. And a lot of the clients that I work with come to me with that exact same, or a very similar lived experience, and the things that we work on enable them to no longer experience that food noise. So what can you actually do that is going to help you reduce food noise, reduce that anxiety that you're experiencing, and be able to move forward with a much more mindful and a much healthier relationship with food and with yourself inevitably. And this applies whether you want to lose weight or not. A caveat to add before I get into this is that for a lot of people, the food noise, even with all the psychological tools and strategies, it still is incredibly oppressive. It still is something that they find very, very difficult to not respond to. And there's a whole host of, biological, psychological, social underpinning reasons for that. And I think that for those people, sometimes the likes of a GLP-1 medication can be absolutely liberating, but not everybody wants to take medication and not everybody has to take medication. So this video is intended for people who do not want to take GLP-1 medication, or who may be even like in a journey of coming off them and are scared of that food noise coming back and want to know what to do about it instead of responding to it automatically. So there's 3 core things that I think every single person who's working on their relationship with food and who wants to reduce their food noise needs to do. The first thing is give yourself unconditional permission to eat, which I know, you're going to be thinking, Clara, if I give myself unconditional permission to eat, I'm going to end up binging. I have zero self-control. I am not going to be able to stop once I start. I beg to differ, because a lot of people think that when they give themselves unconditional permission to eat, that they will open the floodgates and they won't be able to stop. But the thing is that the more you tell yourself that you're not allowed to eat certain things, the more your mind is going to be fixated on wanting to eat more of those things. And that's where a lot of that food noise comes in, right? It's from this like prohibited, naughty list of things that your mind fixates on. Remember what I said earlier about trying to get rid of a thought? The more we tell ourselves, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't eat that, I'm not allowed to, that doesn't fit my macros, that's unhealthy, that's shit, that's going to make me binge. Inadvertently, what we're doing is we're making our mind think about that stuff all the time. And so inevitably we end up experiencing much louder, much more intrusive thoughts about that very thing that we're trying deliberately not to think about. So when we give ourselves, and when we practice giving ourselves unconditional permission to eat whatever we want, what we're doing is we're approaching food with a level of neutrality, or we are at least trying to approach food with a level of neutrality in which we're telling ourselves that all food to an extent is equal for all intents and purposes, and that we are allowed to have whatever we want. In asking that question though, what we're opening ourselves up for is the reflective question of, okay, well, what would I like to eat, right? If I can eat anything at all, what do I want to eat right now? And I can guarantee that even if you were to give yourself permission to eat anything at all, anything unrestricted, just unconditional permission to eat whatever you want, that you might still make a choice to have chocolate and pizza or whatever those foods are for you. But it is incredibly unlikely that you would consistently make those choices every single day if you had the choice to make those choices at any time point. Okay, so if you don't have to wait until the weekend to have chocolate, if you don't have to wait until, a Tuesday to have a pizza, when you give yourself unrestricted access to food, you're much more likely to be able to make a decision that is based on your wants and your needs, and not based on these rigid rules or like an automatic response of shame that is maybe going to accompany a food decision. So giving yourself and practicing giving yourself an unconditional permission to eat whatever you want is the first and incredibly important step to take if you want to reduce food noise. Now, alongside that, eating enough is absolutely fundamental. Food noise is a biological need. It's not something that, you have decided, or that's something that's faulty with you. If we hadn't had food noise throughout our evolutionary history, we would have perished, because actually accessing food, or, hunting or gathering, whatever it might have been, was incredibly energy costly. It was not a practical thing to have to do. And if our ancestors could have gone without that, they would have. So actually food noise is essential to our survival. So recognizing that the more you try to restrict your food intake, the more likely it is that you're going to have higher food noise is important to remember. And it's important to keep that in mind, because like I said, giving yourself unconditional permission to eat whatever you want and also making sure that you're eating enough throughout the day are both essential steps to reduce your food noise. Because if you're hungry, well, you're literally fighting biology and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of evolutionary history that are literally designed to make you think about food when you're undernourished and when you're not giving yourself sufficient food, because that is going to drive you to eat, as it should have driven and as it did drive our ancestors to go out and, hunt something or pick some berries or collect some nuts or something like that. So most fundamental step to reduce food noise is eat enough, eat consistently, and give yourself unconditional permission to eat whatever you want, because otherwise your mind will fixate on what you're not allowed to eat, and that is only going to increase the volume of the thoughts around those things, making you far more vulnerable and far more likely to notice the urge and notice the compulsion and not be able to stop thinking about that thing until you actually have it. Because funnily enough, eating the food itself does quieten food noise, which is why often food noise leads to binging. The second most important thing that you need to do, and again, these aren't necessarily in order, I do think that these all kind of go together, but a very important second thing to work on is self-compassion. And what I mean by this is that when you struggle with food noise, it's likely that over time you have developed a very binary view of foods and of yourself in response to those foods. So if you categorize a certain food as being a bad food or a naughty food and you see yourself eating that food, you're also going to absorb that normal, that rule, or that adjective for yourself. You're going to see yourself as a bad person, as a naughty person doing bad things. And so when the way that you see yourself becomes dependent on the food decisions that you make, your mind is going to be constantly on high alert, making sure that you're not putting yourself in a precarious position that would then lend itself to lots of self-attacking thoughts, because that is incredibly unpleasant and very, very distressing. So because though the way that you see yourself is dependent on the food choices that you make, your mind is constantly going to be on high alert, assessing situations, trying to think about what's a good food, what's a bad food, right? So it's almost like because your view of yourself isn't unconditionally kind, because you're likely to be very self-critical and certainly not be very self-compassionate. If you're watching this video, if you've struggled with food noise for a significant period of time, what that leads to is your mind to be constantly on high alert thinking about food. So when you work on your self-esteem, when you work on reducing your self-criticism, when you work on building your self-compassion and making it unconditional, so not dependent on the food choices that you make, then the food choices that you make become far less consequential to your sense of self. And because food choices are no longer a threat to the way that you see yourself, your mind doesn't have to be on hypervigilance all of the time. And when your mind isn't on hypervigilance, it's likely that the number of thoughts that you have about that particular thing, in this case food, is going to reduce. Certainly the intensity of it will, and or the intensity of the urge to act on it will reduce, meaning that your food noise will also reduce as a consequence to that. And if you want to start building your self-esteem, if you want to start building your self-compassion and reducing your self-criticism as a means to reduce your food noise, head to the link in the description where it says 4-week self-esteem builder. Download it completely for free, and the steps that you follow in those 4 weeks will help you build the tools that will support that reduction in food noise over time. And thirdly and finally, the thing that you need to do if you want to reduce your food noise is actually understand the function that food plays in your life. What role does food have? When you notice the urge to eat, what is that in response to? What's happening before you have a thought about food? What happens as a response to the thought? What happens in your mind when you notice yourself thinking about food? What other thoughts come into your head? What other emotions come up? And how do you feel after you've eaten food? So understanding the role that food is playing in your life is incredibly important to reduce food noise, because if you don't understand what food is doing for you, maybe it's helping you soothe, maybe it's helping you disconnect, maybe it's helping you, get into a bit of a trance, maybe it's helping you self-soothe, maybe it's helping you distract, maybe it's helping you feel better, maybe it's doing so many things for you. But if you don't understand the role of food in that context, it's going to be very difficult to reduce food noise, because the reality is that food is probably not actually meeting the genuine need that you have in that moment, right? So if you eat, for example, in response to difficult emotions, and food is something that is helping you self-soothe, unless you start to build alternative ways or additional ways of self-soothing that do not include or require food, that food noise is going to persist. So it's very important to actually understand the function of food, the role that food plays for you, and the role that that food noise plays in your life too, right? So when that food noise becomes really loud, is it something that's showing up because it distracts you from other important thoughts, from other difficult thoughts? Is it a means of avoidance? Is it a means of moving away from something else, like from distracting from pain? What's actually going on there? There's so many different questions that I could be asking around this, but genuinely understanding the function of food in your life, understanding the function of the food noise is very important, because everything makes sense in context. It's never irrational. There's always a reason for why our mind overly fixates and loops around certain things like food, like food decisions, like the Jenga and the backflips gymnastics that your mind ends up doing with food. They all make sense in context, and we need to be able to understand parts of that context to be able to move away from that food noise being so intrusive and being able to have a bit more food freedom. Obviously, food noise is a huge topic that takes a lot of work to tackle, but those 3 steps are a great place to start if you're currently struggling with a lot of food noise and you don't know what to do about it, and you don't want to start taking medication in an effort to reduce it. So like I said, Make sure that you're eating enough and make sure that you're giving yourself unconditional permission to eat. I know it sounds scary, but genuinely the more you're able to do that, the less likely you are to continue to binge in response to loud food thoughts. The second thing that you need to do is build your self-compassion, and you can do that by downloading my 4-week self-esteem builder completely for free. And the third and final thing that you need to do is better understand the function of food, which you will do if you download my 4-week self-esteem builder, but in and of itself, start to reflect on actually what purpose does food and food noise have in your life? How is it working? What's happening in and around that? And developing more of that understanding is going to help you de-shame your food noise and de-shame your experiences around food, which obviously is going to make it a heck of a lot easier for you to continue to work on building a much more open and healthy relationship with food, with exercise, and inevitably with yourself. I hope you found that video useful and helpful. If you've got any questions about food noise, or if you want me to develop any more of these ideas in more depth, please let me know in the comments. Make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss out on any future videos, and as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.